Hello, everyone, and welcome to Stories TH. If you're ready for a spine-chilling mystery, you're in the right place. In today's story, we're diving deep into a terrifying case where a 9-month pregnant woman's ordeal takes an unimaginable turn. Stay with us until the end, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Stories TH for more thrilling content every week. The dark night and the risky decision. The mysterious encounter. Helen sat in the car, gripping the seat with both hands as the pain in her abdomen grew more intense with each passing minute. The heavy rain outside splashed against the windows, while the windshield wipers fought to clear the downpour, making it harder for her to focus on anything except the discomfort rippling through her body. She was nearly 9 months pregnant, and the baby should have been arriving soon. But this wasn't like any labor pain she had experienced before. Her husband, Jack, was driving with a calm expression, his eyes focused on the road, but his clenched hands on the steering wheel betrayed his anxiety. Helen could tell he was worried, yet he hadn't said much since they left the house. The silence between them was thick with unspoken fears. Helen wanted to ask him how he was feeling about everything about the baby, about their future, but her attention was consumed by the overwhelming waves of pain that seemed to surge unpredictably. But something wasn't right. Helen's breath came in short, labored gasps as another contraction seized her body. It felt wrong. This wasn't the rhythmic, manageable pain that she had been preparing for. No, this felt like something much worse. It was as though there was a force inside her, thrashing, pushing violently against her insides. It wasn't just the baby moving. Something else was there, something alive, something that didn't belong. Her hand instinctively went to her stomach, and she gasped as she felt it, something shifting underneath her skin, something that wasn't her baby. The sensation was so intense, so unfamiliar, that for a brief moment, Helen wondered if she was losing her mind. She tried to breathe through it, trying to focus on the familiar rhythm of Jack's steady driving, but the pain only intensified, filling her with a deep sense of dread. "Helen!" Jack's voice broke through her thoughts. His tone was soft, but she could hear the concern laced in his words. "Are you okay? You're shaking." I don't know," she murmured, barely able to speak through the clenched teeth as another wave of pain hit her. Her hands gripped the seat tighter. "Something's wrong. Jack, I feel like there's something moving in there." Jack's eyes darted to her for a moment, before quickly returning to the road. His face stiffened slightly, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he pressed the gas pedal harder, trying to get them to the hospital as quickly as possible. He didn't show it, but Helen knew he was just as scared as she was. She could see in the way his jaw tightened, the subtle furrow in his brow. But it wasn't just fear she sensed in Jack. There was something else, something she couldn't quite place. His unease seemed different from hers. It wasn't just about the baby. It was something deeper, something more mysterious. Was he hiding something? Her mind raced with the thought, but she couldn't focus on it now. She needed to get to the hospital. Her vision blurred with the pain, and the next thing she knew, the car was pulling up in front of the hospital. The flashing lights of the emergency entrance lit up the night sky, casting an eerie glow across the rain-soaked pavement. Jack quickly parked the car, and without saying a word, he rushed around to open her door. Helen could barely stand, her legs weak from the pain. She felt like her body was failing her, and the force inside her belly kept pushing harder, as if trying to escape. Jack's hands were steady as he helped her out of the car, but she noticed that he avoided looking at her face. His gaze was fixed ahead, focused on the doors to the hospital. As they entered the emergency room, a nurse quickly greeted them. "We're ready for you," she said, her voice calm but efficient. "Let's get you to a bed, Mrs. Carter." Helen didn't even have time to respond. The nurse helped her onto a gurney, and before she knew it, they were rolling through the sterile halls of the hospital. The lights buzzed above her, and the sound of her own heartbeat seemed to echo in her ears, pounding like a drum. But there was still something in her stomach. It was as if something was clawing, struggling to get out. Every instinct told her that this wasn't a normal pregnancy. What was inside her wasn't just her baby, it was something else. The hospital room was bright, with the constant beeping of machines and the busy movement of nurses and doctors around her. The cold air made her shiver, but it did little to calm the feeling of dread that had settled in her chest. She needed answers, and she needed them now. "Doctor, something's wrong," Helen gasped as the nurse prepared to check her vitals. "There's something inside me. Something else." The nurse looked at her, her expression unreadable, and then nodded, signaling for another doctor to come over. "We'll check it out right away, Mrs. Carter," the nurse said. "Please try to stay calm." But how could Helen stay calm when she could feel the unnatural movements inside her, when her body was no longer her own? The pain was unbearable, and now it was becoming clear to her that the baby she had been waiting for was not the only thing inside her. The doors to the room opened again, and a team of doctors rushed in, all wearing serious expressions. One of them, Dr. Harris, immediately approached Helen's bed and began to check her vitals. His face turned grim as he monitored the readings. "We need an ultrasound now," he ordered, his voice tight with urgency. Helen's heart raced as she was wheeled toward the ultrasound room. She could feel the sensation inside her growing stronger, more violent, as if the thing inside her was trying to break free. Jack followed behind, but he still didn't speak. His silence was deafening, and Helen couldn't help but wonder what he was hiding. As the ultrasound machine was prepared, Helen felt a coldness wash over her. She was terrified, not just for her baby, but for what she might discover. What could it be that was causing this pain, this terror inside her? The moment the ultrasound probe touched her belly, everything went silent. The screen flickered to life, and the doctors stared in shock. The image on the screen was unlike anything they had ever seen before. What appeared to be a fetus was twisting violently, its form unlike any normal baby. Its movements were erratic, its shape distorted beyond recognition. Helen's breath caught in her throat as she saw the horrified expressions on the doctors' faces. What had been growing inside her was no longer a child. It was something else entirely. Dr. Harris turned to Helen, his face pale. "We need to prepare for an emergency procedure," he said, his voice shaking. "This isn't a normal pregnancy." As the room buzzed with activity, Helen's mind raced with 1,000 questions. What was going on? Why hadn't anyone told her about this? And most importantly, what was Jack's role in all of this? Her life, her baby's life, and the truth about what was happening were all hanging in the balance, and the answers were just out of reach. But one thing was clear: whatever was inside her was no ordinary baby. It was something far darker, something far more sinister. And this was only the beginning. The risky decision. The atmosphere in the emergency room was heavy with tension. The hum of fluorescent lights above seemed louder in the silence, interrupted only by the sound of nurses rushing about, preparing equipment, and doctors consulting hastily on medical charts. It felt as if time had slowed, each passing second bringing more weight to Helen's fear and uncertainty. Helen's hands were trembling as she clutched the edge of the gurney, her face pale, a thin sheen of sweat coating her brow. The pain was still there, relentless and growing, twisting her insides as though something monstrous was crawling inside her. Each movement she made, each breath she drew, seemed to bring a new wave of pain that cut through her with a sharp, unforgiving edge. She couldn't focus on anything else. The sensation inside her belly was unlike anything she had ever felt before, an unnatural presence that made her stomach turn with fear. She had expected labor pain, but this was different. Something wasn't right. The power inside her belly, this force, felt like it was alive, fighting to break free. The pain was no longer a natural part of childbirth, but something more sinister, something far beyond her comprehension. Her mind raced, but her body could barely keep up with the overwhelming sensations. Jack walked beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, but his demeanor remained distant. His eyes were trained ahead, focused on the hallway as they navigated through the hospital. Helen noticed the tension in his posture, the way his jaw was clenched and his knuckles turned white from gripping the handle of the gurney. But he didn't say anything. He didn't offer any words of comfort or reassurance. There was no "it's going to be okay," or "we'll get through this." His silence was suffocating, and it only added to the weight of her growing dread. Why wasn't he reacting like she was? Why wasn't he showing more concern for her pain, for their baby? As they reached the doors of the emergency room, Helen's chest tightened. She could feel the eyes of the medical staff on her as they wheeled her in, their expressions a mixture of concern and curiosity. There was something about the way they looked at her, something she couldn't place, but it made her feel even more like an object under observation, a specimen on display. Helen Carter? A nurse stepped forward, clipboard in hand, looking at the chart. We've been expecting you. Please lie back while we check your vitals. Helen tried to focus on the nurse's voice, but her mind was clouded. All she could hear was the pounding of her heart, each beat amplified by the fear spreading through her body. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to ask why this was happening to her, but her voice caught in her throat. The pain had taken away her ability to speak freely. The nurse continued speaking, but Helen could barely process the words. It was as if everything around her was muffled, distant, and unreal. The only thing that was real was the pain in her abdomen and the terrifying sensation of something alive within her, moving against her will. Jack still hadn't said a word. He stood at the foot of the gurney, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Helen's gaze flickered to him, searching for some kind of reassurance. But he didn't even look her way. His eyes were fixed on the medical equipment, the heart monitor beeping steadily, the drip that had been set up in her arm. His lack of emotional response was unsettling, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized how strange it was. He should have been worried, should have been showing some sort of concern, shouldn't he? They were about to have a child together. Their lives were about to change forever. Instead, Jack acted like this was all just another inconvenience, another obstacle in his way. She wanted to scream at him, demand that he show some emotion, some feeling. But instead, she kept quiet, unsure what to say. The room began to fill with more doctors and nurses, and Helen's heart rate spiked as they started preparing for the ultrasound. The cold gel was applied to her belly, and the sound of the ultrasound machine coming to life seemed to fill the room, its rhythmic buzzing growing louder as the doctor moved the probe over her skin. Jack still hadn't moved. He hadn't even looked at her as the medical team worked on her. It wasn't until the screen flickered to life that his gaze shifted, his eyes narrowing slightly at the image. The image on the screen wasn't the soft, peaceful silhouette of a baby like Helen had hoped for. No, it was something wrong. It was thrashing violently, its shape twisting and distorting. The doctor's reactions were immediate, but Jack remained still, his face expressionless. Helen could see the look of shock in the eyes of the medical team, but it wasn't until she saw the doctor's face that she realized something was terribly wrong. Dr. Harris, a seasoned physician, took a quick step back, his eyes wide with disbelief. His hand trembled as he adjusted the ultrasound machine, his voice shaking. "We need to prepare for surgery immediately," he ordered. "This isn't a normal pregnancy." Helen's head spun, her vision blurred. Surgery? What did that mean? What was happening to her baby? To her? But it wasn't just the medical staff that was acting out of the ordinary. It was Jack, too. His face had gone pale, and there was a flicker of something dark in his eyes, a hint of fear, maybe even guilt. For the first time, Helen saw something in his gaze that made her skin crawl. Was he hiding something from her? She had always trusted him, but now, with the terror that filled her chest, she started to doubt everything she had known about him. "Jack," Helen whispered, her voice weak. "What's going on? What's happening to our baby?" But Jack didn't answer. He only looked at the monitor, his eyes locked on the image of the creature inside her womb, his lips pressed into a tight line. His silence spoke volumes. And then it hit her. The thought that she had been pushing away, the thought that had been lingering in the back of her mind, broke through like a tidal wave. It wasn't just the baby that was inside her. It was something else, something far darker. And Jack, he knew. He had to know. As the doctors scrambled to prepare for the emergency procedure, Helen's heart raced with a new, unfamiliar fear. It wasn't just her baby that she needed to worry about now. It was everything. Every piece of her life, every ounce of trust was now in question. And with each passing second, the mystery deepened, pulling her into a nightmare from which she wasn't sure she could escape. The panic, The moment the ultrasound image flickered on the screen, it was clear that the situation was far worse than any of the doctors had anticipated. The room, which had been filled with the usual clinical hum of hospital equipment, suddenly grew heavy with an unspoken dread. The usual protocol for a delivery wasn't just being questioned, it was being violently upended. Dr. Harris stood frozen for a moment, staring at the monitor. His face had drained of color, his usually calm and measured expression replaced with one of disbelief. His mouth opened, but no words came out at first. The image on the screen wasn't what anyone expected to see. It wasn't a baby. What appeared before them was something grotesque, something unnatural. The fetus was no longer recognizable as a human being. It was writhing, contorting in ways that defied the very principles of biology. Nurses around the room began to whisper, their voices low and trembling. Some clutched the edge of the nearest equipment, seeking something to ground them, as if the very walls of the room had suddenly started to close in on them. Panic was beginning to take hold of everyone, even those who had spent their careers preparing for the worst. This, however, was something they were not prepared for. "Doctor, what is that?" one of the younger nurses asked, her voice quivering with fear as she pointed toward the screen. "What happened to the baby?" Dr. Harris swallowed hard. His eyes never left the screen, and his knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the counter. The image of the creature moving violently in Helen's womb was burned into his mind, and a sense of urgency gripped him. He had never seen anything like this before. His medical experience, the countless surgeries and procedures he had conducted over the years, had never prepared him for a situation like this. The implications were staggering, and his mind raced to comprehend it. "We need to get her into surgery immediately," Dr. Harris muttered, finally breaking his silence. His voice was tight, filled with urgency, but there was a subtle tremor in it that betrayed his panic. "This isn't a normal pregnancy. We need to act now." The other doctors in the room exchanged uneasy glances, their brows furrowed in disbelief. No one moved for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Some wanted to argue, to question Dr. Harris's words, but the sight on the screen was undeniable. Something was terribly wrong. There was no time for debate, there was only time to act. The tension was palpable. A young intern, Dr. Miller, who had only been with the hospital for a few months, stepped forward hesitantly. His voice was quiet but trembling. Should we call a specialist? This might be beyond our ability to handle," he said, his eyes flickering nervously between Dr. Harris and the other staff. He didn't want to overstep, but this was beyond anything he had encountered in his brief career. He had no idea what kind of medical phenomenon this was. Dr. Harris's gaze snapped toward him, sharp and cold. "A specialist?" he repeated, his tone almost biting. "We don't have time for specialists, Miller. We need to act now, or we'll lose both the mother and the child." His words were harsh, but there was no denying the panic that had started to creep into his voice. He was grasping for control, trying to prevent the situation from spiraling even further. But as he spoke, his eyes flitted nervously toward the screen once more, the horrific image still dancing in his mind. Behind him, Dr. Thompson, a more experienced surgeon who had seen his fair share of emergency procedures, looked visibly shaken. He adjusted his glasses, glancing from Dr. Harris to the screen, and then to Helen, who was still lying motionless on the table, unaware of the chaos unfolding around her. What if it's a birth defect? Some kind of severe abnormality? Dr. Thompson asked quietly, trying to offer an explanation, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. Dr. Harris let out a long, shaky breath. "If it were just a birth defect, we'd be able to handle it," he said, his voice steadying slightly, though his hand was still trembling. "But this is something else. Look at the way it's moving. It's not natural. This creature, it shouldn't exist." The panic in the room deepened. The doctors were still reeling from the shock of what they had seen. They had been trained to deal with difficult births, to save lives under dire circumstances. But nothing in their years of practice could have prepared them for this. They were standing at the edge of something they couldn't understand, and it was beginning to tear them apart. A nurse near the door gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "I don't think we can handle this," she whispered, the color draining from her face. What if it's dangerous? The words seemed to hang in the air, thick with dread. It was one thing to be confronted with the unknown, but it was another to be faced with the terrifying possibility that whatever was inside Helen might pose a lethal threat to them all. They were all trapped in this room with an unknown, hostile force. The very idea of the creature inside Helen could mean disaster, not just for her, but for everyone around her. Dr. Harris closed his eyes for a moment, trying to regain some semblance of composure. "We have to save her," he muttered under his breath. "We can't let this thing take her life. We need to act. Get the or ready." As he spoke, the tension in the room reached its peak. The doctors and nurses moved swiftly, but there was a sense of disarray, like a ship desperately trying to avoid crashing into the rocks, but unable to steer in time. They were making decisions on the fly, driven by fear as much as their medical knowledge. "Get the operating room prepped," Dr. Harris ordered again, his voice more firm now. The urgency was clear, but the panic had not entirely subsided. The nurses scrambled to prepare the necessary equipment, but their hands were shaking, their actions erratic. Helen, lying on the gurney, barely registered the chaos around her. The pain was still excruciating, but her mind had drifted somewhere far away. She was dimly aware of the voices, of the frantic whispers and the cold hands on her body, but all she could focus on was the agony radiating from deep inside her. The creature that had been inside her was no longer a vague, distant presence. It was alive, struggling, and she could feel it. But what was it? What had happened to her baby? And most terrifying of all, why wasn't Jack speaking? Why wasn't he trying to comfort her, hold her hand, or even explain what was happening? She turned her head slightly toward him, hoping to find some sign of reassurance. But Jack stood there, his face expressionless, as though he were watching an event unfold that had nothing to do with him. Her heart sank. The truth had never been clearer. Jack was hiding something. And whatever it was dark, and it was about to change everything. The secret on the ultrasound screen. The grotesque fetus. Helen's mind was racing, her vision blurred with pain, as the sound of her own heartbeat echoed in her ears. She could hear the frantic voices of the doctors, the soft beeping of the monitors, and the rustle of medical instruments being prepared. But nothing could prepare her for what came next. The cold gel on her swollen belly felt like an invasive force, as if it were trying to unearth some hidden truth buried deep inside her. As Dr. Harris moved the ultrasound probe across her stomach, the screen flickered to life. The once familiar image of a baby in the womb, a peaceful, natural formation, was nowhere to be found. What appeared instead was a dark, squirming mass. The image on the screen twisted and distorted, as if the very shape of the fetus was struggling to maintain its form. It was not human. It couldn't be. Helen gasped, her chest tightening as she stared at the horrifying figure on screen. It was a thing of nightmare, a grotesque shape writhing violently inside her, thrashing in an unnatural, almost predatory way. It didn't move like a baby. It moved like something else, something malevolent. The usual small, gentle movements of a fetus were replaced by erratic, violent jerks, and the size of the creature was disproportionate to what it should have been. Its limbs twisted, almost unnaturally long, and its form shimmered with an unsettling darkness. It was no longer a part of her. It felt like an invader, a parasite feeding off her very being. Helen's breath caught in her throat as she struggled to comprehend what she was seeing. What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. But no one answered her immediately. The doctors were silent, their expressions frozen in a mixture of shock and disbelief. Dr. Harris, who had always been a figure of authority, looked pale, his hands shaking as he stared at the screen, unable to look away. The nurse beside him glanced nervously at her colleagues, the terror evident in her eyes. That's not human, is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," Dr. Harris finally managed to say, his voice tight. "It's not human, but it's in her." Helen could feel the world spinning around her. The pain, once a sharp, constant throb, was now drowned out by the raw terror that gripped her chest. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but her throat had gone dry. She could only stare at the screen in disbelief, hoping that somehow this was a mistake, that what she was seeing wasn't real. But it was real. The creature moved with an eerie sense of purpose, as if it had its own consciousness. And it was inside her. The baby she had been waiting for, the baby she had nurtured for 9 months, was gone, replaced by this thing, this monstrous thing that seemed more alien than anything human. The ultrasound continued to display strange, disjointed movements, each second more unsettling than the last. The limbs of the creature twisted unnaturally as it shifted and squirmed in ways that defied biology. There were no clear boundaries between its body parts, no defining features of a human child. It was as if the fetus had mutated into something grotesque, unrecognizable, and terrifying. Helen's mind was in overdrive. She tried to piece together what had gone wrong, but the answers were elusive, slipping through her fingers like sand. Could this be a mistake? Was this some kind of horrifying medical anomaly? But no, she had felt it. She had felt the movement inside her, the violent thrashing, the sensation of something alive, but not normal. This was not her baby. Dr. Harris leaned closer to the monitor, his face pale and drawn as he studied the image in front of him. We've never seen anything like this, he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. The words sounded hollow, like he was grasping at straws, trying to make sense of the impossible. Behind him, the other doctors were still processing what they had just witnessed. One of the nurses began to shake her head, unable to look at the screen any longer. "We need to get her out of here. We need to get that thing out of her," she said, her voice rising in panic. But Dr. Harris raised a hand to silence her. "Not yet," he said. "We need to keep her calm. We need to understand what we're dealing with before we do anything." The urgency in his voice did little to comfort Helen. She was trembling, barely able to keep her eyes open as the terror inside her grew. The thing inside her was alive, and it was fighting to escape. Her instinct screamed for her to run, to get away from the room, from the thing that had invaded her body, but her legs were weak, her body paralyzed by fear. The pain surged again, sharper than before, and she gasped for breath, clutching at the sides of the gurney. But the pain wasn't the worst part anymore. It was the fear of the unknown, the absolute horror of what was happening inside her. Was it a result of something genetic, something biological gone wrong? Or was it something more sinister, something unnatural? Helen could feel her thoughts spinning out of control. What had she done wrong? She had followed every instruction, gone to every appointment, taken every precaution. How had this happened? Why had this happened? The room was silent, except for the soft beeping of the heart monitor. The doctors and nurses had fallen into a grim, uneasy quiet, as if they were waiting for the inevitable, but none of them knew what that inevitable was. The thing inside her was still thrashing violently, still moving in ways that seemed impossible, yet undeniable. Helen could feel it, its presence growing stronger, its force becoming harder to ignore. And she knew, deep down, that there was no going back from this. There was no undoing the horror she was experiencing. "Get ready for surgery," Dr. Harris said at last, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of fear. He turned to the nurse beside him, who immediately began preparing the necessary instruments. There was no time to waste. Whatever this thing was, it was clear that it wasn't going to allow a natural birth. The surgical team had no choice but to act swiftly. But as the preparations began, Helen's mind raced. How could they even begin to remove something that wasn't human? How could they deal with an unknown entity, something that defied all logic and medical understanding? The questions piled up, one after another, but she couldn't grasp the answers. All she could do was wait, helpless and terrified, as the unknown creature inside her continued to fight for its freedom. The room was filled with a sense of dread, and as they wheeled her into the operating room, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that the true horror was only just beginning. The terrifying discovery. The operating room was cold, the sterile environment humming with the sounds of machines, the constant beeping of monitors, and the soft rustle of surgical instruments being prepared. Dr. Harris stood at the center of it all, his hands steady, but his mind racing. He had been a surgeon for over 2 decades, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the horrors that lay ahead. This wasn't just a routine emergency surgery. It was a race against time, a desperate attempt to save not only Helen, but the very humanity that seemed to be slipping away with each passing second. Helen was unconscious on the operating table, her face pale and her body limp. The pain had subsided with the anesthetic, but the terror still clung to her, hovering in the room like a shadow. The team of nurses and doctors moved around her with precision, their every movement deliberate and practiced, yet there was an undercurrent of unease that none of them could shake. They had seen many things, but nothing like this. Dr. Harris was preparing for the incision, his gloved hands steady as he picked up the scalpel. He took a deep breath, knowing that this was the moment of no return. His mind flashed back to the ultrasound, the monstrous image on the screen, the writhing creature inside Helen's womb. What was it? What was happening? Was it something that could be explained away by medical science? Or was it something far darker, something far more terrifying? He steeled himself and made the first incision. The scalpel cut through Helen's skin with ease, but the tension in the room was palpable. Every eye was trained on the wound, waiting for what would come next. The feeling of the scalpel slicing into her abdomen was unlike anything Dr. Harris had ever experienced. It was too smooth, too fluid, almost as if the body itself was yielding to the incision in ways it shouldn't. The skin parted easily, but there was something odd about it, something unnatural. And then, just as Dr. Harris was about to deepen the incision, something happened. A sound, unlike anything they had ever heard before, filled the room. It wasn't a cry or a scream, it was a deep, guttural wail that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the operating room. The sound came from deep within Helen, from the very core of her body, as though the creature inside her was alive, fully aware, and trying to escape. The noise was deafening, a primal, eerie cry that sent chills down the spines of everyone present. It was as if the sound was not just coming from Helen's body, but from the very depths of something ancient and dark, something that should not exist in this world. The doctors and nurses froze. For a moment, no one moved. They all stood there, shocked, their eyes wide in disbelief. The cry continued, echoing off the walls, growing louder and more desperate with each passing second. Helen's body seemed to convulse, her limbs jerking slightly, but she remained unconscious, unable to respond to the horror unfolding inside her. What is that?" one of the nurses whispered, her voice trembling. Her hand shook as she held a sterile cloth, her eyes glued to the incision site. That's not human." Dr. Harris didn't have the answers. He couldn't even comprehend what was happening. His heart pounded in his chest as he took a deep breath and carefully extended the incision. As the blade moved further, there was a sudden shift. Something inside Helen stirred violently. It was as though the creature had felt the blade's approach, and it reacted with the fury of something desperate, something that would stop at nothing to break free. The operating room was filled with the sound of snapping and cracking, as though bones were being broken or distorted. But it wasn't just the noise, it was the sensation, the feeling of something large, unnatural, and alive moving within her. The tension in the room was unbearable. The medical staff had no idea what to expect, but they were about to find out. With one final tug, Dr. Harris widened the incision, his breath catching in his throat. What emerged from Helen's body was not a baby, not even a fetus. It was something entirely different, something unearthly. At first, it was just a glimpse, a shadow, but then it began to emerge more fully. The creature was slick and black, its body writhing with an unnatural fluidity. Its skin was shiny and wet, like oil, and it seemed to crawl from within her body with a horrible, disjointed movement, as if it were being pulled by an invisible force. The creature's limbs were elongated, unnaturally so, and its form twisted in ways that no human being ever could. It was grotesque, a nightmare made flesh. The room fell silent, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The creature's movement was jerky, almost mechanical, but there was a horrifying intelligence in its eyes. Eyes that were too large, too black, too hollow. They seemed to stare straight at the team, almost as if it were studying them, sizing them up. The nurses gasped, some stumbling backward in shock, their faces drained of color. One of the younger nurses turned to the side and vomited into a nearby trash bin, unable to look away from the creature. Dr. Harris stood frozen for a moment, his mind trying to process what he was seeing, but his body too overwhelmed by the terror of it all. It wasn't just a creature, it was a predator, a thing born of something far darker, something far more dangerous than any of them had ever imagined. It moved slowly at first, dragging itself out of Helen's abdomen, its strange, fluid movements unnerving everyone in the room. The creature's skin shimmered in the sterile lights, its twisted form stretching out as it freed itself from the confines of her body. Helen's body convulsed again, but this time there was no sound. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow, but she remained unconscious, unaware of a nightmare that had just been brought into the world through her. The creature was fully out now, its body twisting and coiling on the operating table, making strange hissing noises as it continued to squirm. It was like watching a nightmare unfold in front of their very eyes, an abomination that should never have existed. The doctor stood paralyzed, unable to act. The creature didn't seem to want to attack, but its presence was so overwhelming that the room felt suffocating. Dr. Harris took a hesitant step back, his mind still struggling to catch up with the reality of the situation. He had never encountered anything like this before. Was this some kind of mutation? Some horrific, unimaginable genetic anomaly? Or was it something far darker? "Get her out of here," one of the doctors finally whispered, his voice shaking. The fear was palpable, his hands trembling as he reached for a set of instruments. They needed to get Helen away from this thing, whatever it was. But no one knew what to do next. They were all staring at the creature, each of them too stunned to act, too afraid to approach it. It was clear that whatever this was, it was far beyond their understanding. But as the creature began to writhe on the table, its eyes locked on them. They all knew one thing for certain: there was no turning back. The nightmare had only just begun. The dark truth, Helen's husband, and the sinister plot. The operating room had descended into chaos. But for Jack, it seemed like nothing more than a distant, irrelevant noise. His presence in the sterile, fluorescent-lit hospital hallway was almost unsettling in its calmness. While Helen was being rushed into surgery, fighting for her life, Jack's face remained eerily composed, devoid of the worry and fear that one might expect from a husband in such a critical situation. He stood with his hands casually in his pockets, gazing at the flickering overhead lights, as if he were waiting for a train rather than the survival of his wife and child. Helen had always known Jack as a man of control, someone who rarely showed emotion. He was practical, focused, and often very calculating. But the strange, almost unnerving lack of concern he displayed in the face of his wife's life-threatening situation made Helen's mind race with confusion and suspicion. Something didn't add up. Jack was supposed to be her rock, her partner in this incredibly intense moment. Instead, he seemed detached, emotionally absent, as though he were a bystander, not the person who should have been comforting her, or at the very least, visibly shaken by what was happening. The more Helen thought about it, the more she began to wonder if Jack's calm demeanor was a facade. Could it be that he was hiding something? Was he really as concerned as he should be about her well-being, or was there something more sinister at play? His behavior had always been a bit enigmatic, but she had never questioned his loyalty until now. Back in the operating room, Dr. Harris and the medical team were fighting an unseen battle. But outside in the hallway, a different kind of tension was building, one that had nothing to do with the medical crisis unfolding in the next room. The hospital security, always vigilant, had begun to notice Jack's strange behavior. He wasn't pacing nervously or making calls to friends and family. He wasn't even speaking to anyone. Instead, he stood quietly, a distant observer, detached from the scene entirely. His gaze, although fixed ahead, seemed to avoid all human contact, almost as if he were waiting for something else to happen, something that had nothing to do with the emergency at hand. At that moment, Detective Taylor, an officer who had been assigned to the hospital for a routine investigation, couldn't help but take notice of Jack's odd behavior. The detective had been watching him for some time, his instincts telling him that something wasn't right. There had been no obvious outbursts or expressions of concern from Jack, no frantic phone calls or anguished responses. Instead, he remained still, his face expressionless, as though he had anticipated the events unfolding around him. Detective Taylor's job wasn't to pry into personal matters, but his suspicions about Jack had been growing steadily. He had seen too many people in crisis, too many spouses caught up in strange circumstances. And something about Jack's behavior seemed off, too calculated, too cold. It was as if Jack knew something they didn't, as if he were part of something bigger, something sinister. The detective decided to take matters into his own hands. He discreetly approached a nurse who had been present during the initial stages of Helen's treatment. "Is it normal for a husband to act so calm under these circumstances?" he asked casually. The nurse hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking to Jack, who was still standing in the hallway, his back to the wall. "It's not typical," the nurse replied softly, lowering her voice. "Most husbands are frantic when their wives are in labor, especially when something goes wrong. But he's different. I've noticed it too. He hasn't said a word since they arrived. He didn't even ask how she was doing, just stared blankly at the screen when they showed him the ultrasound." Detective Taylor nodded slowly. Something was definitely off. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but filled with curiosity. As he turned to leave, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to Jack's indifference than met the eye. There was something about the way he stood there, looking at nothing in particular, as if waiting for an outcome he already knew. It was as if Jack wasn't worried about the chaos unfolding in the operating room, because he had already planned for it to happen. The detective quietly began his investigation. He started asking questions, speaking to the hospital staff, trying to piece together Jack's movements and history. It wasn't long before the puzzle began to take shape, revealing a disturbing pattern. There was no mention of Jack in any of the hospital's records prior to Helen's emergency admission, no sign of his involvement in her prenatal care. For someone so deeply involved in the pregnancy, this was unusual. More disturbing still was the discovery that Jack had been in contact with a mysterious third party. According to the hospital's phone records, Jack had made several phone calls in the days leading up to the incident, calls to an unlisted number, calls to someone whose identity remained unknown. Detective Taylor's suspicion grew with each passing moment. As he dug deeper into Jack's past, the fragments of his life began to reveal something dark, something dangerous. Jack's background, though seemingly impeccable on the surface, contained gaps, places where the trail went cold, individuals who remained silent when questioned about him. More alarmingly, Taylor uncovered records that linked Jack to a pharmaceutical company known for conducting controversial and illegal experiments. The company was notorious for using human test subjects without their knowledge or consent. Was Jack involved in something more than just a suspiciously indifferent husband? Was he part of a larger conspiracy, one that involved his own wife? The pieces began to fit together. Jack was not just a bystander in this nightmare. He was an active participant. The creature inside Helen was no accident. It was the result of a twisted and deliberate plan. The ultrasound had shown a monstrous, non-human being writhing inside her, but it wasn't just a freak occurrence. It was the product of Jack's involvement with a secretive and dangerous organization. They had been conducting experiments on human subjects, and Helen had been an unwilling participant in one of their experiments. Taylor's investigation began to reveal the unimaginable. Jack had known from the beginning that something was wrong with Helen's pregnancy. He had been part of a plan to use her as a test subject for this grotesque project, all the while pretending to be the loving husband. His cold indifference was not a sign of worry. It was the sign of someone who had already accepted the outcome, someone who knew exactly what was going to happen and wasn't at all concerned by it. Helen had been betrayed, and now, as the truth began to unravel, Detective Taylor knew he had to act fast. He had to find a way to protect Helen from whatever horrors Jack had brought into her life. But the more he uncovered, The more he realized that this was not just a case of a man failing to protect his wife, it was a much deeper, darker conspiracy that would take everything to expose. As Jack continued to wait outside, his cold, emotionless demeanor never wavering, Detective Taylor made his decision. He would confront Jack, expose the truth, and stop the madness before it spread any further. But would it be too late to save Helen? The horrifying experiment. As the hours passed in the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the hospital, the disturbing reality of Helen's situation became harder to ignore. The creature inside her had already begun to reshape the course of her life in ways she couldn't possibly have imagined. But as Detective Taylor dug deeper into Jack's past, the horrifying truth began to unfold. Helen's pregnancy, the creature in her womb, and the terrifying mystery that was consuming her life were all part of something much larger. Something that Jack had been a part of from the beginning. Jack was not just a man who had failed to act when his wife needed him most. He was an active participant in a monstrous, underground research operation. The more Taylor uncovered, the more it became clear Jack was connected to an organization that was conducting horrifying biological experiments. These experiments were far from ethical. They were dark, twisted, and illegal in every sense. The very nature of the work was enough to send chills down anyone's spine, but the fact that Jack was involved in such a conspiracy made it even more chilling. Helen's condition, which had seemed like a random, tragic complication, was no accident. It wasn't a freak occurrence. What was happening to her was the result of years of manipulation, experimentation, and a deliberate disregard for human life. The creature inside her wasn't just a product of nature gone awry. It was the horrifying consequence of an experiment gone horribly wrong. The very thing that had been growing inside her for the past 9 months was a creation, a monstrosity birthed from unethical research that Jack had knowingly supported. The first time Detective Taylor had connected the dots, it had hit him like a bolt of lightning. Jack's involvement with a pharmaceutical company, known for pushing the boundaries of medical science, wasn't a coincidence. This company had been linked to secretive and illegal research projects, biological experiments that had been performed on unwilling human subjects. Jack, it seemed, had been complicit in these projects from the very beginning. His indifference toward Helen's suffering was not the behavior of a clueless husband. It was the response of someone who had known exactly what was happening all along. He wasn't just standing by while his wife was subjected to a horrific fate. He was orchestrating it. Helen's condition, the strange, violent creature growing inside her, was the product of these experiments. The creature had been genetically engineered, altered in ways that were beyond comprehension. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a calculated, deliberate creation. The monster inside her had been bred as part of a series of experiments designed to push the limits of human biology, to create beings that defied the laws of nature. And Helen had been chosen, forced into becoming the unwilling host for this abomination. The more Detective Taylor uncovered, the more the pieces began to fall into place. The organization behind these experiments wasn't just any research company. It was a shadowy, underground group that operated with complete secrecy, hidden from the eyes of the public and the law. This group had been conducting experiments for years, using human test subjects as their guinea pigs, subjecting them to unspeakable procedures in the name of progress. The goal was simple: create something new, something that could push the boundaries of biology. And in Helen's case, they had succeeded, but not in the way they had hoped. As Taylor delved into the dark underbelly of this operation, he found that Jack was much more than just an employee or a passive observer. He was an integral part of the process, a key player in the twisted experiments that had led to this moment. Jack had played a role in ensuring that Helen became part of the experiment. He had manipulated her, put her in harm's way, and knowingly subjected her to the very horrors that were now unfolding inside her body. His calm, collected demeanor was not the result of shock or fear. It was the result of his deep, unwavering commitment to the organization and the experiments they were conducting. The creature inside Helen was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of research and experimentation. It was a product of genetic manipulation, designed to be a hybrid of human and something else, something unknown. The creature was a monstrosity, a freak of nature, but it was also proof of the terrifying advancements the organization had made in their research. They had crossed a line that should never have been crossed, and now, the results of their actions were becoming all too clear. As Detective Taylor pieced together the full scope of Jack's involvement, he found that the experiment had started long before Helen's pregnancy. The organization had been working in secret for years, testing their theories on unwilling subjects who had been chosen at random, manipulated, and discarded once they had outlived their usefulness. Jack had been one of the primary architects of these experiments. He had worked with the organization for years, overseeing the operations, making sure that the tests were carried out without interference from the law or the public eye. But the worst part of it all was the realization that Jack had never planned on saving Helen. In fact, he had never planned on saving any of the women who had been subjected to these experiments. They were nothing more than vessels, means to an end. Helen, like the others before her, had been chosen because she was vulnerable, because she trusted Jack. He had made sure she became part of the experiment, ensuring that she would carry the creature to term, all while maintaining the appearance of a loving husband, a concerned partner. But all along, he had known the truth. Helen wasn't just carrying a baby. She was carrying the end result of something far darker, something that Jack and his colleagues had set in motion. As Detective Taylor continued to uncover the details of Jack's involvement, he knew that the time had come to expose the truth. He had to stop Jack and the organization before they could hurt anyone else. The experiments had to be shut down, and the truth had to be revealed to the world. But the more he dug into the organization's operations, the more dangerous it became. The people behind these experiments were powerful, and they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Jack, as much as he seemed detached from the chaos, was at the heart of it all, and Taylor knew that taking him down would be the first step in exposing the full extent of the horror. The situation was becoming increasingly dire, and Helen's life hung in the balance. The creature inside her was not just a physical threat, it was the result of years of manipulation, a twisted legacy of scientific experimentation gone horribly wrong. The truth was darker than Helen could have ever imagined. And as the investigation into Jack's role continued, Detective Taylor knew one thing for certain: this was no longer just a matter of saving a woman's life. It was about stopping an evil force that had been quietly growing unnoticed for far too long. Rescue and the cruel decision. The operating room was filled with an eerie tension, the air thick with the sound of frantic beeping, rushed footsteps, and hushed murmurs. The surgical team moved in a disjointed, chaotic rhythm, all sense of precision abandoned as they faced a nightmare no one had prepared for. The lights overhead flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the cold metal instruments, highlighting the urgency of the situation. Helen was still unconscious, her body limp but strained under the burden of the incredible trauma she had endured. Her abdomen had been cut open, and yet, even as the medical team worked to save her, there was no sign of the monstrous thing inside her being fully contained. The creature, whatever it was, continued to shift, twitch, and writhe beneath the surface of her body, as if it were fighting for survival in the only way it knew how. The sedative had barely begun to take effect, and though it had quieted the creature's more violent movements, it was still very much a danger. Dr. Harris, usually calm under pressure, now found himself caught in a whirlwind of uncertainty. He had never faced anything like this in his career. This was no longer a normal delivery. This was a battle one that pitted Helen's life against the horrifying presence inside her, and it was not clear which side would win. "We can't keep her under much longer," Dr. Harris muttered, his voice strained with the weight of responsibility. "We need to make sure that creature doesn't wake up while we're still working. It's the only way we'll get her through this." The team worked in frantic unison, each member aware that every moment spent in indecision or hesitation could cost Helen her life. But the questions continued to swirl in the air. Could they save her? Was it even possible to remove the creature without causing fatal harm? And would she survive once it was all over? Nurse Claire, who had been with Helen through the entire ordeal, held her hand tightly, offering silent support. But even she couldn't shake the fear in her heart. She had been through countless emergencies, yet nothing prepared her for the sight of that creature, or the cold, detached demeanor of Jack, who had shown no emotion through it all. The creature's form, still partially visible within Helen's abdomen, remained an enigma, shifting like some grotesque shadow, fighting against its captors. Dr. Harris and his team had never seen anything like it. It was not just an aberration. It was an organism that did not belong in the realm of science as they understood it. It had no place in a human body, no natural function. It was unnatural, its presence like a grotesque joke that nature had played on them all. Helen, however, remained oblivious to much of the growing chaos. Her body was worn from the labor, but the emotional toll of what was happening was even greater. She had been through the physical pain of the contractions, the horror of seeing the creature on the ultrasound screen, and now the excruciating sensation of having her body violently violated in ways she could not understand. She was trapped in a nightmare, a place between consciousness and oblivion, unable to make sense of the hell unfolding inside her. The agony was unimaginable. Then, as Dr. Harris's hands moved with swift precision to continue the surgery, something shifted within Helen's body. The creature, still struggling beneath the surface of her skin, let out a guttural, inhuman growl. The sound reverberated through the operating room like a low rumble, and the medical team froze. The creature was waking up, becoming more alert, more alive. The sedatives weren't enough. "It's waking up," one of the nurses shouted, her voice thick with panic. Dr. Harris's heart raced. The situation was escalating, and there was no room for error. "We need more sedation. Now," he ordered, but it was already too late. The creature inside Helen's body began to push against the incision, as if trying to break free, and its movements became increasingly violent. Helen's body convulsed on the operating table as the foreign organism struggled for escape. It wasn't just alive, it was fighting for survival. The room was filled with the sound of strained breath and panicked voices. The team's efforts, once so calculated, now felt helpless, their movements frantic as they tried to stabilize both Helen and the creature within her. The creature's violent thrashing intensified, and the medical team had no choice but to respond with equal force. Dr. Harris made the fateful decision. They couldn't keep trying to sedate it, it was only prolonging the inevitable. The creature had to be removed, but it wasn't as simple as just taking it out. This wasn't a routine surgery. There was no protocol for something like this. Every step could lead to disaster. "Helen is losing too much blood," Dr. Harris muttered to himself, his mind racing. "We don't have much time left." In that moment, a decision was made, one that would haunt them all. "Get ready for the worst," Dr. Harris ordered, his voice steady but grim. "We have to take the creature out now." It was a decision that weighed heavily on him. He knew the risks. Removing the creature from Helen's body could kill her. But if they didn't act fast, she wouldn't survive the trauma of its violent movements. It was a choice between the unknown horrors of the creature and the certainty of her death from blood loss and shock. With a deep breath, Dr. Harris grabbed the surgical instruments, his hands shaking only slightly despite the pressure. He began to cut, carefully and methodically, working to make the incision large enough to allow them to remove the creature without further damaging Helen's body. His team worked in silence, moving like clockwork, but the fear in their eyes was palpable. Helen's body jerked once more, but the sedative had taken hold, and her breathing became steady, her face still and calm in contrast to the nightmare happening inside her. The room was filled with tension as the creature's shape began to emerge from the wound, slowly, agonizingly. Each movement from the creature was like a grotesque dance of survival, its slick, dark form making its way out of Helen's body. It was monstrous, alien, and it was alive. As Dr. Harris pulled the creature free, the room seemed to hold its breath. The creature was larger than expected, its body covered in slick, oily skin. It had large, bulbous eyes that blinked once, then twice, before locking onto Dr. Harris. Its movements were slow but deliberate, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire room was caught in its gaze. It was over. The creature was out, but the cost was still unclear. Dr. Harris could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Helen's body was still struggling to stabilize, and although the creature was now removed, it was far from certain that the danger had passed. The room remained tense, everyone waiting for the moment when the true consequences of the surgery would become clear. Is she okay?" one of the nurses asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Harris didn't answer immediately. He focused on Helen, monitoring her vitals. Her pulse was steady now, and her breathing was more even. But the truth remained, this was only the beginning of their battle. The creature was gone, but what it had left behind was more complicated than anyone could have predicted. "We've done what we could," Dr. Harris said, his voice low, his face weary. "Now we wait." As they moved Helen to the recovery room, the team couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The creature was gone, but the unknowns that surrounded it, its origins, its purpose still hung over them like a dark cloud. The decision had been made. Helen had been saved, but at what cost? The fight between life and death was not over, and the true battle was just beginning. The danger grows worse, the creature's attack. The operating room, which had once been a place of cold, clinical focus, now felt like a war zone. The sterile white walls, usually comforting in their order, now seemed oppressive, like the walls of a cage closing in on all those trapped within. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, the steady beep of monitors, and the occasional whispered words of the medical team. But that was all drowned out by a far more terrifying sound, the guttural growl of the creature that had been extracted from Helen's body. It was supposed to be contained. They had removed it. They had sedated it. But no one had anticipated just how much more dangerous this creature was. As it lay on the table, its form still slick and alien, something changed. Its eyes, large and haunting, blinked open again. It wasn't just alive, it was aware. The creature's body twitched, muscles tightening under its unnatural skin. It had been dormant, almost like a passive, unwilling passenger in Helen's body, but now, free of its confines, it was something more. It was a predator, and they were its prey. Nurse Claire was the first to notice. She had been tasked with securing the room, keeping everything in order as Dr. Harris and the rest of the surgical team worked to stabilize Helen. Her eyes were on the creature, a mixture of curiosity and fear tugging at her when she saw it. The creature's body jerked, its claw-like hands twitching as though it were testing its new surroundings, preparing to move. Before anyone could react, it moved. The creature lunged with lightning speed, and its claws scraped across the sterile metal of the operating table, sending a jolt of horror through the room. It wasn't just crawling or wriggling now, it was hunting. Its movements were sharp, predatory. Its eyes locked onto the nearest person, a young intern who had been standing too close, unsure of what to do. "Watch out!" Claire shouted, barely getting the words out before the creature made its move. It leaped off the table with frightening agility, its slimy body sliding across the floor, its sharp claws swiping at the intern. The young doctor screamed as he stumbled back, but not quickly enough. The creature's claws raked across his arm, leaving deep, bloody gashes as it hissed, its teeth bared in an unnatural snarl. "Get back," Dr. Harris shouted, his voice a blend of authority and desperation. He was no longer just trying to save Helen, he was trying to survive. The creature was unpredictable, its behavior completely alien, and every instinct told the doctors that they were dealing with something that was far more than they had expected. As the intern backed away, clutching his bleeding arm, the creature turned its attention toward Dr. Harris. It moved faster than anyone could track, its body twisting with a fluidity that seemed unnatural for such an organism. It crawled across the floor with terrifying speed, its large eyes never leaving Dr. Harris as it closed the distance between them. In a flash, the creature's clawed hands shot out, and Dr. Harris barely had time to raise his arm in defense. The creature's claws scraped across his forearm, the force of the impact pushing him backward into a sterile cabinet. Blood trickled from his arm, but his mind was focused only on the creature, on keeping it away from the others. His mind raced with one urgent thought: containment. They had to contain it. The room had descended into chaos. Nurses scrambled for equipment, trying to find anything that could be used as a weapon, but nothing seemed like it could hold off the creature. The sedative, which had once seemed like a hopeful solution, was no longer effective. The creature was too powerful, too dangerous, and the shock of its violent behavior left everyone in a state of stunned paralysis. "Get it away from us!" Claire shouted, clutching a sterile tray to her chest like a shield. She had never been trained for anything like this. No one had. She threw the tray toward the creature, hoping to distract it, but the impact did little more than annoy it. The creature hissed again, its sharp teeth glistening as it bared its fangs at her. The room was in full chaos now. Dr. Harris, bleeding from his own wounds, was desperately trying to formulate a plan. But every time he made a move, the creature anticipated him, its reflexes too fast, its instincts too sharp. There was no way to predict its next move. There was no fighting it, only surviving. Suddenly, another nurse, a more experienced staff member, bolted toward the supply cabinet and grabbed a large syringe filled with a stronger sedative. "We need to knock it out. Now," she yelled, rushing forward to inject the creature. But as she approached, the creature let out an ear-splitting screech that shook the very walls of the operating room. It turned to face her, and in that moment, it became clear the creature was not afraid. It wasn't just a wild animal. It was a threat, an intelligent one, fully aware of its environment and its power. It lunged at her with a speed that defied belief. Before she could inject the sedative, the creature's clawed hand struck her, sending her flying backward into a stack of medical supplies. The sedative syringe flew from her hand, skittering across the floor as she collapsed, gasping for breath. "Shut the door," Dr. Harris shouted, his voice sharp. He grabbed a nearby metal instrument and threw it at the creature, but the monster dodged effortlessly, its form almost liquid as it slithered across the room. It was becoming increasingly clear that brute force alone wouldn't stop it. They needed something more: a strategy, a plan, anything to survive. In the chaos, Nurse Claire reached for a fire extinguisher on the wall. "Fire extinguisher. That could work," she screamed, rushing forward. Dr. Harris nodded, grimly understanding what she was suggesting. They needed something that could incapacitate it, something that could slow it down enough for them to regroup. As Claire pulled the pin and aimed the nozzle, the creature hissed again, sensing the threat. But it was too late. The cold foam sprayed out with a hiss, enveloping the creature in a cloud of chilling frost. It screeched, its body writhing in the spray, but the foam quickly began to freeze its slick skin, slowing its movements. The creature thrashed, but its limbs became slower, its efforts more desperate as the foam froze it in place. It wasn't over. Not yet. But for the first time since the creature's violent attack began, the medical team felt a glimmer of hope. The foam had bought them precious time, but they knew that the creature could break free at any moment. They couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. "We need to finish this," Dr. Harris shouted. His voice was hoarse, his body tired, but there was a renewed urgency in his eyes. They had fought to contain it, to prevent it from killing them all. Now, they had to finish what they had started. As the creature lay in a frozen, half-conscious state, the doctors and nurses carefully prepared for what would come next. They had no idea what the creature truly was, but they knew one thing for sure: it was not done yet. And neither were they. Jack's intervention. The operating room was now a scene of utter chaos. The medical team, once composed and professional, was barely hanging on as they fought for their lives. The creature, which had once been merely a horrifying anomaly inside Helen's womb, was now a full-fledged threat, an alien force wreaking havoc in a space that should have been dedicated to saving lives. The surgical staff struggled to contain it, but with each passing moment, their control over the situation slipped further away. Helen, unconscious and barely clinging to life, lay on the operating table, her body riddled with the trauma of what had transpired. Her breath was shallow, her pulse weak, and every second that ticked by seemed to bring her closer to the edge of death. The doctors, disoriented by the events unfolding around them, fought to maintain their focus, but the danger of the creature was undeniable. It was relentless, its alien form far more powerful than anything they had ever encountered in their careers. And then, in the midst of the turmoil, the door to the operating room opened. Everyone froze, their attention momentarily diverted as Jack stepped into the room. His face, usually calm and composed, was now set in an expression that betrayed no fear, no panic, only a cold, unsettling calm. He stood in the doorway, surveying the chaos, his eyes glinting with something more than just concern for his wife. The nurses and doctors looked at him with a mix of confusion and suspicion. This wasn't the time for a bystander to simply walk in. Jack wasn't a part of the medical team, and yet here he was, standing in the midst of a life-or-death struggle. But what was most unsettling was the fact that Jack showed no visible sign of distress. His eyes, typically full of warmth and empathy, now appeared distant, calculating almost as though he were observing a spectacle rather than participating in the desperate fight for Helen's life. Dr. Harris, who had been focused intently on the creature, shot Jack an irritated glance. "What are you doing here, Jack?" he demanded, his voice tense but laced with frustration. "This is a medical emergency. Your wife needs help." Jack stepped forward, his presence commanding. He didn't speak immediately, but instead, his gaze drifted toward the creature, which was still struggling to free itself from the foam restraint. It was a chilling sight, and for a moment, Jack's eyes lingered on it, as though he was assessing its every movement. The tension in the room thickened. "I'm here to help," Jack said finally, his voice cool, his words almost too calm for the gravity of the situation. There was no urgency in his tone, no panic, just a flat, unsettling assurance. Dr. Harris was caught off guard. He had expected Jack to be beside himself, to demand answers, or to plead with the doctors to save his wife. But Jack wasn't acting like a man desperate to save the mother of his child. No, there was something off about him, something that made Dr. Harris uneasy. "Help," Dr. Harris repeated, his eyebrows furrowing. "Help? The only thing you can do is stay out of the way." But Jack didn't move. Instead, he kept his eyes fixed on the creature, his hands folded in front of him, almost as if he were waiting for something. It was then that Dr. Harris noticed the glint in Jack's eyes, a cold, calculating look that was all too familiar to someone used to dealing with danger. It was a look that betrayed far more than just concern. It spoke of someone who was in control, someone who had expected all of this to happen. "Get him out of here!" a nurse shouted, her voice shaky as she glanced nervously at Jack. She stepped forward, clearly frustrated by his uninvited presence. But Jack's gaze turned on her with such icy precision that she faltered, stepping back without another word. "Let him stay," said Dr. Harris, his voice low and steady despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. "But Jack, you need to understand this isn't some minor complication. We're not dealing with just a medical emergency here. This thing inside your wife is dangerous. If you want to help, stay out of the way and let us work." Jack nodded, though the subtle smile on his lips hinted at something more than just compliance. "I'm not here to be a spectator, Dr. Harris. I'm here because I know exactly what needs to be done." The words sent a chill down Dr. Harris's spine. What did Jack mean by that? Jack's gaze never left the creature, even as the doctors scrambled to prepare more sedatives. They were trying to subdue it, to contain it, but it was clear that no amount of chemical intervention would stop it for long. The creature was simply too powerful, too relentless. "Doctor," Jack finally spoke again, his voice unwavering. "There's no need for more sedatives. They won't work. I know exactly what needs to happen next." Dr. Harris turned to Jack, incredulity written across his face. "What are you talking about? We need to sedate it, contain it, and remove it. It's our only chance." "No," Jack replied, his voice steady. "What you need to do is kill it. If you don't, it will kill her. This thing, it's not just a creature. It's part of something much bigger, something that none of you understand." The room fell into stunned silence. The creature was still struggling on the table, but the doctors and nurses stopped moving, their attention now fully on Jack. Dr. Harris was too stunned to speak, but the tension in his jaw tightened. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice hard. Jack looked at him, his expression impassive. "This is the endgame. You've been fighting the wrong battle this entire time. If you don't destroy it, it will destroy her, and then it will destroy everything." "What do you mean by everything?" Dr. Harris asked, his voice almost a whisper, as if Jack's words were some kind of unspoken truth hanging in the air. Jack stepped closer to the creature, and for the first time, the doctor saw a flicker of something more than just indifference in his eyes. It was the hint of a plan, a scheme, something calculated and deadly. "It's not just a freak of nature," Jack said coldly. "It's a weapon, a tool, and Helen was chosen. She was always meant to carry it." Dr. Harris's heart sank as the weight of Jack's words settled in. The realization hit like a gut punch. What was happening wasn't just an accident. It was intentional. Helen hadn't just been a victim of bad luck or a medical anomaly. She had been part of a twisted plan all along. Jack's hand moved toward the creature, and the room braced for what would come next. The air seemed to thicken, and a sense of dread filled the space. The creature, still trapped and weakened by the sedative, turned its head slowly, its black eyes locking onto Jack's. He had known all along. "You never should have come here," Dr. Harris muttered under his breath. The horror was clear. Jack's presence wasn't just unwanted, it was a threat. And it was one that none of them could have predicted. Jack had come for a reason, and that reason was far darker than anyone had expected. The broken family bonds, the revelation of Jack's truth. The investigation into Jack had begun as a simple inquiry, driven by suspicion, but it quickly spiraled into something much darker, uncovering truths that no one had expected. For Helen, it was the beginning of a nightmare that seemed to have no end. What she had once believed to be a solid, loving marriage now appeared to be a facade, a well-crafted lie that Jack had maintained for years. As the details of Jack's involvement in the sinister events surrounding her pregnancy began to surface, Helen found herself drowning in a sea of betrayal and heartbreak. The first crack in the facade came when Detective Taylor, following up on a series of confidential leads, uncovered a series of disturbing records about Jack's involvement with a secretive organization. This organization was not just any research group. It was one that had conducted dangerous, unethical biological experiments. It was through these experiments that the creature had come into existence, and Helen had been its unwitting vessel. But what really shocked the detective and ultimately Helen was the discovery that Jack had been complicit in every step of the process. He was not just a passive bystander in this nightmare. He was an active participant, a driving force behind it all. Helen's world shattered further when she was shown evidence of Jack's ties to the organization. It turned out that he had been part of a much larger, much darker plan, one that involved using women like Helen as test subject for twisted experiments. Jack had kept this secret from her, all the while pretending to be the loving husband and father-to-be. He had lied to her every day, knowing exactly what was happening inside her body, and yet he had never once told her the truth. Helen had always trusted Jack. She had believed in him, believed that he was a good man, and that their relationship was built on love and mutual respect. But now, with every new piece of information that came to light, that trust crumbled. She felt betrayed, used, and utterly powerless. The man she had married, the father of her child, was not the man she thought he was. He was a liar, a manipulator, and worst of all, a willing accomplice in something far darker than she could have imagined. As Detective Taylor continued to dig deeper, the web of deceit only grew more complicated. Jack's ties to the organization went back years, and his role had been more than just that of a passive participant. He had been involved in selecting the women who would become the subjects of these experiments, and he had been the one who orchestrated much of what had happened to Helen. The creature inside her, the one that had caused so much pain and terror, was the product of Jack's decisions. The moment that truly shattered Helen came when she was shown a video, a hidden recording that Jack had left behind. It was clear from the footage that he had known exactly what was happening. The video depicted him speaking to a member of the organization, calmly discussing the next steps in the experiment, and even expressing excitement about the results. He had known that Helen would be used as a subject, and he had never once questioned it. He had been complicit in her suffering all along. The pain that Helen felt was indescribable. Her husband, her partner in life, had been part of the conspiracy to use her as a pawn in a dangerous experiment. She had carried a monster inside her, not by accident, but because Jack had chosen for her to do so. He had chosen to betray her trust for his own reasons that, for now, remained unclear. All she knew was that her marriage, the one she had once thought was a bond of love and trust, was a lie. Her emotions were a whirlwind: anger, sorrow, disbelief, but the most overwhelming feeling of all was betrayal. Helen had always known that life was unpredictable, that bad things could happen to anyone, but she had never imagined that the person closest to her, the one person who was supposed to protect her, would be the one to destroy everything she held dear. With each revelation, Helen's world became more distorted. She couldn't understand how Jack could do this to her. Was he always like this? Had he been hiding his true nature from her all along? Or had something changed in him over time? And more importantly, what was the ultimate goal of this experiment? Why had Jack agreed to participate in such a horrific scheme, and what did he hope to gain from it? As she sat in the quiet of her hospital room, reading through the documents and listening to the painful truths that had been uncovered, Helen was struck by a profound sense of loneliness. She had no one left to trust, no one who could understand the depth of her pain. Her family, her friends, they had no idea what she was going through. They had no idea what had really happened. The man she had loved and trusted for so many years had betrayed her in the most unimaginable way, and now she was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. The betrayal was not just personal, it was systemic. Jack had been part of something far bigger than just an individual betrayal. His actions were tied to an organization that had manipulated and harmed countless others, using them as mere instruments for their twisted experiments. And now, as Helen confronted the truth, she realized that she had been caught in the crossfire of something that was beyond her control. She had never chosen this path. It had been chosen for her. In the days that followed, Helen was consumed by a mix of emotions: anger, grief, confusion, and above all, a sense of deep betrayal. Her relationship with Jack was irreparably broken. But even worse, she now found herself questioning everything she had ever known about love, trust, and the people closest to her. How could she have been so blind? How could she have trusted a man who was capable of such cruelty? And yet, despite all of this, there was still a part of her that couldn't let go, a part of her that still wanted to believe in the man she had once loved. But the truth, as painful as it was, couldn't be denied. Jack's actions had changed everything. There was no going back, no mending the broken trust. All that remained now was the choice of what to do next. Would she confront Jack, demanding the truth, or would she walk away, leaving him behind to face the consequences of his own actions? Helen's journey was far from over. The wounds inflicted by Jack's betrayal would take time to heal, but she was determined to move forward, to rebuild her life and find a way to heal from the scars that had been left behind. But first, she had to face the painful truth. The man she had trusted with her heart and her future had never truly been the man she thought he was. The unforgivable betrayal. Helen sat alone in the sterile, white hospital room, the sound of the monitors humming in the background as a constant reminder of the life that still hung in the balance. The events of the past few days had felt like a nightmare, one that she couldn't escape no matter how hard she tried. Her mind swirled with the truth that had been laid bare before her, the unthinkable revelation about Jack, the man she had once trusted more than anyone in the world. The pain that Helen had endured, both physical and emotional, was overwhelming. Her body was battered, bruised, and scarred from the traumatic birth, but it was the emotional wounds that cut the deepest. She had always known that life had its fair share of challenges, but never in her worst nightmares had she imagined the depths of the betrayal that Jack had subjected her to. What was worse, the person she had trusted with her life had caused her the most profound pain imaginable, not just by allowing the monstrous creature to grow inside her, but by intentionally exposing her to something so vile, so dangerous. The physical agony of carrying the creature, of enduring the pain of labor, was nothing compared to the emotional toll of learning the truth. Helen had spent months preparing for the birth of her child, filled with hopes and dreams for the future. She had thought she and Jack were in this together partners, united in love and the promise of parenthood. But all of that was a lie. Jack hadn't been concerned about the future they would share. He had been working in the shadows, pulling the strings of a much darker plan, one that had used her as nothing more than a vessel for his own ambitions and the machinations of a secretive organization. The truth was simple, yet devastating. Jack had never cared for her the way she thought he had. He had been an accomplice in her suffering, an architect of her pain. Now, as she sat in the silence of the hospital room, Helen could feel the weight of the betrayal pressing down on her. Her hands, trembling in her lap, clenched into fists as the anger surged within her. How could Jack have done this? How could he have lied to her for so long, watching her suffer, watching her struggle through the physical and emotional trauma, all while knowing the truth? The anger was blinding, like a fire that burned from the inside out, consuming every ounce of her strength. The betrayal went beyond Jack's actions during her pregnancy. It was everything he had hidden from her over the years. Helen had given him her trust, her love, and in return, he had used her. He had chosen to be part of a scheme so horrific that the idea of it made her stomach turn. Jack's indifference to her pain, to the life growing inside her, had been calculated from start. He had never truly been her partner. He had been a puppet master pulling the strings, controlling her life without her ever knowing it. The days following the revelation were some of the darkest of Helen's life. Every moment seemed to stretch into infinity, and each day felt like a battle she had to fight just to breathe. The weight of the emotional pain was more than she could bear. She couldn't escape the thought of what Jack had done and what he had been willing to sacrifice to achieve his own twisted goals. Her mind raced, replaying the moments she had shared with him, all of them now tainted by the knowledge that she had been nothing more than a pawn in his game. The physical pain, though excruciating, was easier to endure than the mental and emotional torment that raged within her. She had been through surgeries, needles, and intense recovery, but nothing compared to the agony of realizing that her trust had been shattered beyond repair. Every memory of their time, together, the laughter, the promises, the shared dreams, felt like a cruel joke, a fabrication designed to keep her blind to the truth. And what hurt most of all was that Jack hadn't just betrayed her, he had betrayed their unborn child. The life that had been growing inside her, the baby she had once believed would bring them closer together, had been reduced to a mere experiment. The creature inside her had been the result of Jack's decisions, his deliberate actions. And now, even after it had been removed, Helen could not escape the sense of loss that gnawed at her soul. She had carried a child for 9 months, and yet it wasn't a child at all. It had never been a child. It had been a twisted product of a scientific experiment that had cost her everything. Helen's anger slowly began to transform into something else, grief, the kind that hollowed out a person from the inside. She had loved Jack with all her heart, and now she was left with nothing but the remains of a shattered relationship, a marriage built on lies. She felt as if her very identity had been stolen from her. Who was she without the love she had placed so deeply in Jack? Who was she without the trust she had given him so freely? As she lay in the quiet of the hospital room, Helen couldn't escape the feeling that she was losing herself. The woman who had once been so sure of her place in the world, who had believed in love and loyalty, was now a stranger to herself. How could she ever trust anyone again? How could she ever love again after being so utterly deceived? The isolation she felt in the aftermath of the betrayal was suffocating. Her family, though well-meaning, didn't know the depth of her pain. They couldn't possibly understand the torment she was going through, the heartbreak, the fury, the overwhelming sadness. Even the friends who had once been her support system felt like distant strangers now. Helen had retreated into herself, unable to explain to anyone just how deeply the betrayal had wounded her. She had been betrayed not only by her husband, but by the very system she had trusted to protect her and her child. There were moments when Helen found herself questioning everything. What was the point of it all? Had her entire life been a lie? The woman she had been before Jack's betrayal seemed so distant now, like someone she used to know but could never be again. She had to face the harsh reality that she would never be the same again. The emotional scars would remain, lingering like dark shadows that no amount of time or healing could fully erase. As the days dragged on, Helen was forced to confront the overwhelming reality of what had happened. She had been betrayed by the one person she had trusted most in the world, and though the physical wounds were beginning to heal, the emotional scars would take a lifetime to fade. She was a mother now, but she was also a survivor of Jack's manipulation, of the experiments, and of the profound grief that came from the betrayal of the man she had once called her partner. The pain was unbearable, but Helen knew one thing for sure. She had to keep moving forward. For her child, for herself, for the future that was still ahead. The betrayal might never fully heal, but she was determined to rebuild her life, to find her strength again. And as she looked at the tiny baby in her arms, she realized that despite everything, there was still hope. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she wasn't going to let Jack's betrayal define her any longer. Resurrection and shaping the future, the nightmare is far from over. The months had passed since the truth about Jack had been uncovered, since the grotesque and terrifying creature had been removed from Helen's body. On the surface, things had begun to settle. The physical wounds were healing, the scars from the surgeries slowly fading into memory. Yet, deep inside Helen, the battle raged on an internal war of psychological and emotional turmoil that no amount of time could fix. She had survived a horrific ordeal, but the trauma of what she had lived through was far from over. Helen's days were filled with an eerie quiet that felt like a strange kind of normal, yet her mind was never still. It raced, a constant whirl of images, sounds, and emotions that she couldn't escape. Every time she closed her eyes, the memories came rushing back, memories of the excruciating pain, of the creature moving violently within her, of the betrayal from the one person who should have protected her. The more she tried to bury these memories, the louder they became, echoing in the recesses of her mind. She had never imagined that the wounds of betrayal could cut so deeply. But what was worse was the psychological aftermath, the sense of losing herself, of losing everything she thought she knew about the world. The birth of her child, though a blessing, was a constant reminder of the darkness that had clouded her pregnancy. Every time she looked at her baby, every time she held him in her arms, she saw not just a beautiful infant, but the living symbol of everything she had suffered. He was the product of the pain, the danger, the experiments, and the betrayal. She loved him with all her heart, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was carrying the weight of everything she had endured within her. Her mind was at war with itself, torn between love for her child and the bitter taste of what had been done to her. The nightmares came often, sometimes so vivid that she would wake up gasping for breath, her body soaked in sweat. In these dreams, Jack was always there, standing silently in the corner, watching as the creature inside her twisted and moved, its alien eyes staring into her soul. She would hear his voice, calm and cold, telling her that she had always been a pawn, that she had never truly been in control. But when she tried to confront him, to scream at him for what he had done, he would fade away, just out of reach, leaving her helpless in a world of darkness. Helen knew that she couldn't outrun these nightmares. The trauma was too deeply embedded in her mind, woven into the fabric of her being. The question was, how could she continue to live with it? How could she move forward when the past clung to her like an unshakable weight? It wasn't just the memories of Jack's betrayal that haunted her. The knowledge of what had been done to her, to the many others who had been part of the experiment, loomed like a shadow over her life. She had never been able to understand why Jack had done what he had, why he had betrayed her so completely. The lack of answers only fueled the darkness inside her. The questions gnawed at her, leaving her restless and unsettled. Had she truly known the man she had married? Was everything a lie? What had been the point of it all? Helen tried to find solace in the small things: her son's first smile, the moments of peace when she could hold him close and feel his warmth against her skin. These fleeting moments of happiness were precious, but they were also fragile. They never lasted long before the weight of the past crept back in, suffocating her once more. There were days when she felt like she was drowning. She would stand by the window, looking out at the world, feeling disconnected, like a spectator in her own life. The people around her family, friends tried their best to support her, but they couldn't understand the depths of her pain. They didn't know what it was like to have your world turned upside down by someone you loved, to have your body used as a tool for someone else's twisted plans. Even in the moments when she tried to convince herself that the worst was over, that the worst had passed, and that she could heal, she felt a crushing sense of emptiness. The guilt lingered. She questioned if she could ever truly heal, if she could ever fully forgive herself for what had happened. How could she have been so blind? How could she have trusted Jack? There was a constant pull inside her, a feeling that she couldn't escape, that no matter how far she moved from the past, it would always find a way back to her. But the most profound pain of all came from the realization that the trauma she had endured was not just hers to bear. It was a pain that would stay with her son, too. He would grow up in a world shaped by her experiences, and she feared that the darkness she carried would somehow find its way into his life as well. The thought of him suffering, of him being affected by the legacy of her pain, was unbearable. She wanted to shield him from it all, to give him a life filled with love and happiness. But she wasn't sure how to escape the ghost of the past that haunted her every waking moment. The emotional scars ran deep, and the healing process felt impossibly slow. But Helen knew that she had to try. She couldn't allow the darkness to consume her completely. She had survived. She had fought and endured things that no one should have to experience. And now, for the sake of her son, she had to rebuild. It wasn't going to be easy. The psychological toll of what she had endured would take years to heal, if it ever fully did. But Helen was determined to find a way forward, to rise above the pain, even if it meant facing her darkest fears head-on. She started small, taking each day as it came. Therapy, when she could find the energy to attend, helped though it was painful. She began to face the trauma, piece by piece, learning to name the feelings that had previously consumed her. It wasn't much, but it was progress. She had learned to acknowledge her anger, her grief, and her guilt, instead of pretending they didn't exist. And that was the first step toward healing. But even as Helen fought to heal, the memories of Jack's betrayal continued to haunt her. She couldn't forget what had been done to her, what he had taken from her. The fight was far from over, but in her son's bright eyes, Helen saw a glimmer of hope. He was her reason to keep moving forward, her reason to build a future where she could one day look back and know that she had survived, that she had overcome the pain. And so, Helen fought. Every day, she fought to rise from the ashes of her past and create a future that was hers to shape. The nightmare had not ended, but with each passing day, the strength she found within herself grew. She might never be the same woman she was before, but perhaps that was a blessing in disguise. She was a survivor, a mother, and in the quiet moments when she held her son close, she knew she was finally beginning to heal. New discoveries about the creature and the underground organization. Helen's journey was far from over. Despite the physical and emotional wounds that had marked her recent past, a new chapter in her life had begun, one filled with questions that demanded answers. The discovery of the horrifying creature that had been growing inside her was only the beginning. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that the truth about what had happened to her was deeply entwined with a dark, secretive world, one that involved Jack, the man she had loved and trusted, as an integral part of a much larger, more sinister plot. The investigation into the creature's origins had already taken a surprising turn. What Helen had originally assumed was a freak accident or medical anomaly now seemed to be part of something far more calculated. As the authorities delved deeper, it became clear that the creature was not simply an unfortunate birth defect. It was the result of years of secret research. And that research had been orchestrated by a shadowy organization that Jack had been a part of for far longer than Helen could have imagined. It all started when Detective Taylor uncovered a series of classified documents that revealed the existence of a clandestine research organization operating far beneath the radar of any government or regulatory body. This organization, hidden from the public eye, had been conducting experimental biological research on human subjects for years. They had been pushing the boundaries of science, creating genetically modified organisms and hybrid creatures for purposes that were still unclear. But one thing was certain: the organization had no regard for ethical boundaries, and its experiments were far more sinister than anyone had realized. As the investigation continued, more chilling details emerged. The creature that had been inside Helen was not a freak of nature. It was the product of years of unethical experimentation. It was part of a larger agenda to create new life forms, to manipulate genetics in ways that violated every rule of science and morality. The organization's research was focused on pushing the limits of human biology, and they had used women like Helen as unwitting test subjects. The more Helen learned, the more she understood the gravity of her situation. She had been chosen, not out of love or fate, but because of a sickening, calculated plan that had been set into motion long before she had even met Jack. Jack, her husband, had played a pivotal role in this secretive operation. He hadn't been a mere bystander. In fact, he had been one of the leading figures in the underground organization. His involvement in the experiments, which had initially seemed like a mystery to Helen, was now beginning to make sense. Jack had been a participant in this dark world from the beginning, and his calm, composed demeanor during the crisis was no longer the behavior of a worried husband. It was the behavior of someone who had known exactly what was happening all along. He had been complicit in the organization's plans, and worse, he had used Helen as a pawn in their twisted game. The more Helen learned about the organization's methods, the more she realized the extent of the conspiracy. The organization wasn't just focused on creating biological experiments. They were also involved in trafficking, illegal surgeries, and other crimes designed to further their research. They had operated in the shadows, using their power and resources to avoid detection, manipulating the system to keep their activities under wraps. The creature inside Helen, which had once been nothing more than an abstract horror, now represented the culmination of their research, a horrific blend of human and something else, something unnatural. The organization's research wasn't limited to just the creature inside Helen. It turned out that Helen wasn't the only woman to have been subjected to these experiments. There were others, victims, really, who had been manipulated and used as part of the organization's plan. The more Detective Taylor uncovered, the more it became clear that Jack had been deeply involved in the selection process, choosing women like Helen to carry the creatures that would be the foundation of the organization's future. Jack had known exactly what was happening to his wife, and yet he had remained silent. Helen's shock deepened as she learned that the organization had planned for the creature inside her to be born, not just as a living being, but as part of a larger experiment that was meant to change the course of science. The ultimate goal was to create beings that were beyond human, beings that could be used for purposes unknown to the public, creatures that would be far more resilient, more capable, and more powerful than anything nature had intended. But what was even more horrifying was the fact that the organization had no intention of stopping. They had been operating for years, testing their theories and perfecting their methods. Now, with Helen's baby as their new test subject, they intended to push the limits even further. The creature inside her was just the beginning. There were others, and the experiments would continue, whether Helen wanted them to or not. The realization hit Helen like a wave. She had been nothing more than a vessel, a means to an end for the organization's sick experiments. She had believed that she was carrying a child, but the truth was far more twisted. Her child wasn't just a baby, it was a product, a biological experiment that had been carefully orchestrated and manipulated. The grief of realizing that her entire pregnancy had been a lie was suffocating. It wasn't just the creature inside her, it was everything that had been taken from her, everything that had been stolen without her consent. As the investigation grew deeper, Helen found herself coming to terms with a new, terrifying truth. Jack was not just a man she had married. He was a cog in the machine of a massive, dangerous conspiracy, a man who had chosen power, control, and secrecy over love, trust, and loyalty. His involvement in the underground organization was not an accident. It was a calculated decision, one that had been made long before Helen had ever set eyes on him. But even as the weight of these revelations bore down on her, Helen knew that she had to keep moving forward. The creature had been removed, but the organization was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next opportunity to carry out their twisted plans. Jack was just one part of a much larger, more terrifying puzzle, and Helen was determined to expose it all. She couldn't undo the past, but she could fight to stop the organization from hurting anyone else. With Detective Taylor's help, Helen began to piece together the final fragments of the organization's operations. She was determined to take down the people who had manipulated her to bring the truth to light. But as the investigation closed in on the organization, Helen realized that the battle was far from over. The organization was powerful, its reach extending far beyond anything she had anticipated. She had to be careful, for the deeper she went, the more dangerous it became. The creature inside her was just one of many secrets waiting to be uncovered, and the world that Jack had introduced her to was far darker than she could have ever imagined. The fight for justice had only just begun. The final decision, the first steps toward reconciliation. After all the horror she had endured, after the betrayal, the pain, and the shocking revelations, Helen finally reached a decision. She couldn't change the past, no matter how much she wished to. What had been done to her child, and to the other victims of the dark organization was irreversible. But she could still choose how she would face the future. And so, after months of grappling with the trauma and psychological scars left by her experiences, Helen made the difficult choice to try to start over. The first step was clear. She had to rebuild her life for herself and her son. He was the only reason she could summon the strength to keep going. Every time she looked at him, his innocent face, his tiny hands reaching for her, she felt a spark of hope ignite in her heart. He was her world, her reason to live. But she knew that in order to be the mother he deserved, she had to heal. She had to find some semblance of peace, even if it seemed impossible. Starting over was not easy. Every corner of her world felt like it carried the weight of her past. The house she had shared with Jack was a painful reminder of all the lies, the manipulation, the betrayal. It was a place filled with memories that no longer felt safe. So, Helen packed up what she could and moved into a modest apartment, far away from the life she had once known. The apartment was small, but it was hers. It was a new beginning, a fresh start. It felt liberating to have space that was free of the darkness that had once consumed her life. At first, Helen struggled to adjust. There were days when the weight of her memories felt unbearable, and the silence in her apartment was deafening. The walls of her new home, though freshly painted and neutral, seemed to close in on her when the pain became too much to bear. She would sit on the couch, holding her son in her arms, and wonder if she would ever truly feel safe again. Could she ever feel whole after what had happened? Could she ever forgive herself for having been so blind? It wasn't just the physical trauma she had to recover from, it was the emotional wreckage. Every day, she fought to reconcile the woman she had been with the woman she was becoming. She didn't recognize herself in the mirror anymore. The face staring back at her was familiar, yet foreign. The woman who had once trusted, loved, and believed in the goodness of people had been replaced by someone who was broken, wary, and filled with a quiet rage that she struggled to keep buried. The nightmares hadn't stopped. They came often, usually when she was alone at night, the world quiet and still. In her dreams, Jack's cold, calculating eyes would haunt her, reminding her of everything he had taken from her. But these nightmares were no longer the same. In the dreams, she was fighting back. She would confront him, face to face, and demand answers. But no matter how many times she faced him, the answers never came. The questions remained unresolved, and the anger in her heart only grew stronger. As the weeks turned into months, Helen began to slowly rebuild her sense of self. She sought therapy, hoping to understand the depth of her trauma and find a way to cope with the lingering fear that gripped her heart. Therapy was a painful process, but it was necessary. She had to confront the memories, to speak the truth about what had happened, and to allow herself to feel the weight of her emotions. It was an exhausting journey, but it was one she knew she couldn't avoid. Through therapy, Helen learned to cope with the constant barrage of feelings that surged inside her. She began to understand that the trauma she had experienced wasn't just something she could forget or move past. It was a part of her journey. And as painful as that was, it was also something that made her stronger. She wasn't the same person she had been before, but she was still alive. She was still here. And that, in itself, was a victory. But even as she tried to rebuild, the shadows of her past loomed over her. The knowledge of what Jack had been a part of, the role he had played in her suffering, and the connection between him and the underground organization continued to haunt her. There were nights when she would sit awake, staring into the darkness, wondering what had happened to Jack after everything had come to light. She had never gotten the answers she needed, never had the chance to confront him in person. The police had done their part. They had arrested Jack, but the details of what had happened to him after his arrest remained a mystery. Was he still a free man, living without consequences? Or had the organization's dark influence kept him in the shadows, protected from the law? Helen wasn't sure she would ever get those answers, and part of her didn't want to. She had learned that closure might not be something she would ever find. The betrayal was too deep, the pain too raw. She would never have the answers that would give her peace of mind, and that was something she would have to live with. Despite the pain, despite the haunting memories, Helen made a commitment to herself and her son. She would not let the past define her future. She would not allow Jack's actions or the organization's influence to continue to control her life. She had survived for a reason. She was still here, still breathing, and she would fight for her son's future. She would fight for their happiness, no matter the obstacles. The past could not be undone, but the future was hers to shape. Helen's first steps toward reconciliation with herself were small, but they were enough. She started to open up to friends and family again, allowing herself to lean on those who cared about her. She made a conscious decision to allow herself to feel joy again, even in the midst of all the pain. She began to take walks with her son in the park, something that had once been a simple pleasure, but now felt like a monumental act of defiance. She was alive. She was healing. It wasn't easy. There were still days when the grief and trauma felt overwhelming. But in those moments, she reminded herself that healing was not linear. It was messy, imperfect, and unpredictable. There would be setbacks, there would be pain, but there would also be moments of joy, moments of peace, moments when she could look at her son and remember why she had fought so hard. The journey was long, but Helen knew that the most important step she could take was the one she had already taken the decision to begin. The decision to reclaim her life, piece by piece. The decision to let go of Jack's betrayal, to set aside the haunting memories, and to embrace the love she had for her son. She could not undo the past, but she could shape the future. And that was enough. The decision. Is forgiveness possible? The weight of the decision before Helen was unbearable. It was a question that she had been asking herself for months. Could she ever forgive Jack? Could she find it within herself to move past the unimaginable betrayal he had caused, the manipulations, the years of lies, and the knowledge that he had been complicit in a dark, underground operation that had used her as nothing more than a pawn? And yet, despite the rage and sorrow that filled her heart, there was still a part of her that couldn't completely erase the years they had spent together, the memories of a time when she had believed in him, trusted him with her life. Helen spent countless sleepless nights tossing and turning, her thoughts racing as she tried to make sense of it all. Her heart and mind were at war. The emotional scars left by Jack's betrayal felt like an unrelenting storm inside her, tearing at the fabric of her being. But no matter how much anger she felt, no matter how deeply the betrayal ran, there was a lingering question that kept her awake. Was forgiveness truly impossible? Could she ever let go of the past and find peace? Or was the damage too deep, the hurt too great for anything to heal it. The idea of forgiveness felt like a foreign concept. How could she forgive someone who had stolen her trust, who had manipulated her for his own gain, and who had watched her suffer while remaining silent? Jack's betrayal was not just an individual act of deception, it was part of something far darker, a twisted conspiracy that had caused so much pain, so much suffering. How could she forgive someone who had played a role in her greatest nightmare? And yet, deep down, Helen knew that holding on to this anger, this hatred, would only continue to hurt her. She had spent so many months consumed by thoughts of revenge, by a desire to confront Jack and make him pay for what he had done. But in the quiet moments, when she held her son in her arms and looked into his innocent eyes, she began to realize that this anger was not helping her. It was only holding her back, preventing her from moving forward. She couldn't let her entire life be defined by the past, by the horrors Jack had subjected her to. If she wanted to heal, if she wanted to truly start over, she had to make a choice. The road to forgiveness was not easy. It was not something that would come overnight, and it was not something that Helen could force herself to feel. But it was something that she had to try for her own sake and for the sake of her son. She couldn't continue to live in the shadow of Jack's betrayal. She had to find a way to let go of the past, to release herself from the chains of resentment and anger that had held her captive for so long. Helen knew that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean excusing the pain Jack had caused or pretending that everything was okay. It meant accepting that she could not change what had happened, and that holding on to the pain would only continue to damage her. Forgiveness was a way of freeing herself from the grip of the past so that she could build a better future for herself and for her son. But even as she tried to accept this, the question remained, could she ever truly forgive Jack? Could she ever face him again, knowing everything that had transpired? The idea of seeing him again, of confronting him face to face, felt overwhelming. What would she even say to him? What words could possibly capture the depth of the pain, the grief, the sense of betrayal that had consumed her? The thought of hearing his voice again, of seeing his face, made her heart race with a mixture of fury and fear. She had never imagined that she would be in this position, forced to reckon with the man she had once loved, now the symbol of her greatest suffering. As the weeks passed, Helen found herself facing the uncomfortable truth. Forgiveness was not something that could be given easily, but it was something she had to work towards. She couldn't simply forgive Jack because it was the right thing to do. Forgiveness had to come from within her, and it had to be something she chose not for Jack's sake, but for her own. She didn't want to carry the burden of anger and resentment for the rest of her life. She didn't want her son to grow up in a home filled with bitterness and regret. In therapy, Helen began to explore the possibility of forgiveness. Her therapist encouraged her to consider what forgiveness meant not for Jack, but for herself. It wasn't about absolving him of his actions or pretending that everything was okay. It was about freeing herself from the power that Jack's betrayal still held over her. The process was slow, filled with setbacks and moments of doubt. But with each small step forward, Helen felt a weight begin to lift off her shoulders. She also began to realize that forgiveness did not mean reconciliation. She didn't have to allow Jack back into her life, didn't have to pretend that their marriage had been anything other than a lie. Forgiveness could be a way of accepting the past, acknowledging the hurt, but also allowing herself to move on. It was about reclaiming her power, about refusing to let Jack's actions define her any longer. But there were still moments of intense emotion when the memories flooded back, when the anger bubbled to the surface, when the image of Jack's cold, calculating face came into her mind. There were times when Helen doubted herself, when she wondered if forgiveness was even possible. Could she really let go of the rage that consumed her? Could she ever truly accept that Jack had betrayed her so completely and still find a way to move forward? The more she reflected on it, the more she realized that forgiveness was not something that could be rushed. It was a journey, one that she had to take at her own pace. It wasn't a destination, but a process of healing, one that would require time, effort, and a willingness to confront the darkest parts of herself. But as the days went on, Helen began to understand that forgiveness was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign of strength. It took strength to look at the man who had caused so much pain and say, "I will not let you control my life any longer." It took strength to choose to move forward, even when it felt impossible. In the end, Helen knew that forgiveness wasn't about absolving Jack or letting him off the hook. It was about freeing herself from the chains that had held her captive for so long. It was about choosing to live in the present, not in the past. And as she held her son close, feeling the warmth of his small body against hers, she realized that the future was still hers to shape. Forgiveness might not come easily, but it was the key to unlocking the door to a better future, a new life, peace, and happiness. Helen had lived through unimaginable pain, betrayal, and suffering, but now, at long last, she was taking her first steps toward a future free from the horrors of her past. It had taken everything she had: strength, courage, and resilience, but she had made it through. The woman she had once been, the one who had been broken and destroyed by Jack's lies, no longer existed. She had been reborn, forged from the ashes of the life she had left behind. And in the quiet moments with her son, she could almost feel herself breathing again, as if the weight of the past was finally lifting, just enough to let her live. Moving into a small apartment, far away from the house where she had shared so many memories with Jack, had been the first step. It wasn't grand or luxurious, but it was hers. It was a space where she could reclaim her life, where she could protect her son and start fresh. The walls, though plain, felt like a fortress, one that shielded them both from the darkness that had once consumed their lives. There, in that new apartment, Helen felt the first glimpses of peace. For the first time in months, Helen was able to find solace in the simplest of moments. There were no more whispered threats, no more cold, calculating smiles from Jack, no more eerie unknowns lurking in the corners of her world. There was only her son, his laughter, and the promise of a life that she could build from scratch. It was small, but it was enough. The world outside may have been unpredictable, filled with unknown dangers, but in her little apartment, Helen had found the beginnings of happiness again. The mornings were quiet and peaceful, just the two of them in their small world. She would wake up to the sound of her son's giggles as he played with his toys on the floor, his innocent face bright and filled with joy. There was no trace of the pain and terror that had once ruled her life. And as she watched him grow, Helen felt a deep sense of gratitude. She was no longer the woman haunted by her past, the one whose body had carried a dark secret. She was a mother, a protector, and she would stop at nothing to ensure that her son would never have to experience the suffering she had endured. At first, it was difficult to find peace. The memories of the creature, of the shadowy organization, and of Jack's betrayal would often surface unbidden, flooding her with grief, anger, and confusion. But she didn't let those memories define her anymore. She had learned that peace wasn't a permanent state, but something that needed to be nurtured and fought for every single day. It was a practice, a process. And every day, she chose to fight for that peace, to carve out space in her heart where joy and love could grow. Helen had always been strong, but the woman who emerged from the wreckage of her past was even stronger. She had faced the darkest depths of betrayal, and she had come out the other side, scarred but not defeated. She had rediscovered her purpose, her role as a mother, as a woman who deserved happiness. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be perfect, but it was a new beginning. For the first time in years, Helen allowed herself to dream again. She didn't know exactly what the future would hold, but she knew one thing. She was going to fight for her son's future. She was going to give him the life she had always hoped for, free from the terror and darkness of her past. And in doing so, she hoped to find a version of herself that was whole again. As Helen settled into her new life, she also began to reach out to those she had once distanced herself from. Family members, old friends, people she had pushed away during the darkest moments of her ordeal. It wasn't easy, but she understood that isolation wasn't the answer. She needed to rebuild those connections, to let people back into her life. And so, bit by bit, she began to heal her relationships, reconnecting with those who truly cared for her. There were days, of course, when the weight of everything that had happened felt unbearable, when the memories resurfaced like a flood, threatening to drown her. But Helen knew that she had the strength to face them. She had already survived the worst. Now all that was left was to rebuild, piece by piece, and create a life that was her own, one that was filled with love, laughter, and perhaps even a little bit of happiness. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but it was her life. And that was enough. The unresolved mysteries. Despite the peace she had begun to find, Helen couldn't ignore the lingering feeling that something was still not quite right. While she had put distance between herself and the horrors of her past, there were still pieces of the puzzle that remained unsolved. The creature that had been inside her, the twisted organization behind it all, and Jack's role in the dark plot, these questions still haunted her. The answers, however, were elusive. It wasn't that Helen was obsessed with revenge or the desire to make Jack pay for his crimes. No, she had already made the decision to move forward, to leave the past behind. But there was something nagging at her, a sense that the organization she had once been a part of unknowingly was still out there. They hadn't been dismantled, at least not entirely. While Jack had been arrested, there was no telling how far the organization's reach extended, who else was involved, or their true goals. And more importantly, had they really given up on their experiments, or was this just the calm before the next storm? Helen didn't want to be consumed by these questions. She had worked so hard to distance herself from the darkness, to create a life that wasn't defined by fear. But every time she closed her eyes, she couldn't help but wonder if there were still shadows lurking in the corners of her world. Would she ever be able to fully escape the nightmare? Or was it only a matter of time before the organization reappeared, more dangerous than ever, with a new plan, a new scheme? As the weeks turned into months, Helen began to take more active steps to uncover the truth. She worked with Detective Taylor, who had been a steadfast ally throughout her ordeal. Together, they began to dig deeper into the remaining fragments of the organization. Taylor had his own suspicions. He didn't believe that the group had been fully dismantled, and he had every reason to suspect that their influence still ran deep. It wasn't just Jack they were concerned about. It was the legacy of the experiments, the twisted science that had driven them all. And as much as Helen wanted to close the door on that chapter of her life, she knew that she couldn't turn a blind eye to what was still lurking beneath the surface. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear that the organization wasn't done yet. They had gone underground, hiding in plain sight, biding their time. And although Helen had no concrete proof, she knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end of the story. The organization was a beast with many heads, and Jack had been only one part of it. The final pieces of the puzzle were still missing. The truth about the creature, the purpose behind the experiments, and the true depth of the organization's influence remained shrouded in mystery. And although Helen had finally started to piece together a new life for herself and her son, she couldn't fully escape the feeling that the past hadn't been erased, it had merely been put on pause. Was it possible to ever truly escape the shadows of her past? Could she ever find the closure she needed? Or would the secrets of the underground organization continue to haunt her, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface? As the story of Helen's survival drew to a close, one thing was certain. The journey was far from over. The scars of the past might never fully heal, and the mysteries surrounding the creature and the organization might never be entirely unraveled. But Helen had made the decision to move forward, and that was the only thing that truly mattered. The questions about her past, about the dark conspiracy that had shaped her life, would remain. But she was no longer the woman who would allow those questions to dictate her future. She had a new life now, one that she would fight to protect, one that she would fill with love, with hope, and with the determination to live, not just survive. Thanks for watching, and we hope you enjoyed today's spine-chilling story. If you want more stories like this, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Until next time, stay safe and curious.